welcome to The Last Word. Can we change the way conservative Indians respond to rape? But if not, how should we respond to such mindsets? That's with the author of Being Indian, Pavan Verma, one of the country's best-known sociologists, Dipankar Gupta, the well-known author Amu Joseph, and the director of the Center for Social Research, Ranjana Kumari. Ranjana Kumari, whether it's politicians, religious leaders, heads of women's commissions, or the RSS Sangh Sanchalak, they've all publicly expressed disturbing, if not objectionable, responses to the Delhi gang rape. How can we change such attitudes and mindsets?
Well, this is a patriarchal mindset where they are looking at women not as individuals who have rights, constitutional rights, who are citizens of the nation, who have all kinds of freedom and liberty as any other person. They are looking at women as in the same kind of social mindset where they are looking at women as objects, as people who are subordinated in relationship between men and women. So that power relations work, and men can exploit women, and that should mean that women must remain within their own boundary. I think these people are irresponsible, who are not willing to grow, in spite of the fact that we have a democratic constitution and our society is moving towards a very different framework at the moment. So such people, just the way anti-national sentiments are expressed by certain people, and they are charged with, by the law, they are punished by the law. Certainly, women need their dignity, their respect. If such kind of statements are being made, we need to regulate them. We need to really put them under some kind of a pressure, so that they do not come up with these kind of irresponsible, misogynistic statements where they are all the time putting the blame. I mean, can you imagine saying that a rapist asked for it?
Absolutely.
A woman who's raped is asked for it. This is totally unacceptable what these people are talking about. They must be regulated.
Pavan Verma,
brought under the law of the land.
All right. Pavan Verma, let's take up some of the statements one by one. Asaram Bapu, for example, seemed to blame the victim for what happened, and furthermore he claimed that if she had called upon her attackers as brothers, and if she had pleaded for mercy, they would have let her go. Objectionable as such statements may be, the problem is that many people seem to believe and agree with him. How do you convince such people that this simply is wrong?
Well, Karan, first of all, we must accept the fact that the way India is hurtling towards its future, there are several Indias being carried together. So the conservative establishment is a fact. The problem is that it's in two segments. The first is openly regressive, and we have seen it in the statements that we have heard recently. It believes that convention, religion, social mores sanction the subordinate role of women. And it is not at all ambivalent about expressing this point of view. But the real problem is that across the middle class, there is also another segment which practices a certain kind of public expression of outrage and another kind of private morality. That is the more dangerous part to handle. How do we change the mindset of people who will conform in terms of their public views, but continue to hold exceptionally regressive views at an individual level in their private lives within their own family? So that's the second problem. There are ways to tackle it, and I would come to it if you want when you ask.
Okay. Let me bring in at this moment Dipankar Gupta. You heard Pavan Verma talk about the hypocrisy that many people actually practice in their lives, where they preach one thing but actually practice another. Clearly, the RSS Sangh Sanchalak doesn't fall into that category, and yet he represents another sort of problem, because he believes that rape only happens in urban India, not in rural India, and that traditional Indian cultural values as practiced in villages are a safeguard against rape. Now, the facts clearly disprove his belief and his claim, but how do you convince him that he's wrong?
Well, I think if you're trying to convince people like the RSS Sanchalak or Asaram, you'll be really wasting your time. There's just no point in trying to convince them. The most important thing, the best way to change patriarchal attitudes is not by holding hands or holding seminars, but by actually implementing the law. And that is the best guarantor for dissolving patriarchal values. Nothing else works, and nothing else works anywhere else in the world, not just India, everywhere. When the suffragette movement was going on in Britain, the kinds of things that British people said about women are very similar to the kinds of things that we're hearing now in India. It is true that men all over the world tend to be the same, but you can trust Indian men to hit rock bottom, which they have. But in some ways, there's a great similarity. So if you're thinking of how to change patriarchal attitude, just think, in a comparative framework, and you'll find that it has only changed because the law was consistently and systematically employed in such cases. For example, in the way in which women were given the right to vote and equality of status, the civil rights movement, when the laboring class in Britain wanted education, all of these things happened because the law was consistently applied. So when you're looking at the picture from a distance and the fair view is long and green, it's fine. But when it comes to the short strokes, remember, only the law works. We keep exercising ourselves about how backward we are and how can we change the mindset, how can we change patriarchy. You can never change patriarchy unless you employ the law, and we have a first-class law to do it. The point is, nobody's interested in implementing it.
The problem, Amu Joseph, is that applying the law works when someone has transgressed the law, but what do you do when several politicians, and to be honest, very many members of civil society themselves, say that women must not dress to attract attention, girls must not go out alone at night, as if the very sight of female flesh or a girl alone is such strong incitement that it automatically leads to rape. How does the law help there? Because these are attitudes, and how do you change those attitudes unless you don't change upbringing?
I completely agree with you, and in fact one of the reasons why I haven't actually managed to write anything after the gang rape in Delhi is that I have been mulling over this very issue. Many of my colleagues and people from the women's movement have said a lot of what I wanted to say about the crime and punishment aspect of it. But this whole, the slew of attitudes that have been, views that have been expressed by various people, and also the focus on the law. I have actually been, it's like a throwback to 1980-81 when the first campaign against rape was launched in contemporary India, and the women's movement, women's groups involved at that time focused on the law and changing the law. Obviously there were changes that were brought in, they were not perfect, but those campaigns worked at least to the extent that some reforms were brought about in the law. But as the years have passed, we've seen that that hasn't made all that much difference. And ultimately, whether it's the police or the judges or even lawyers, politicians, so many people continue to hold views which militate against the implementation of the law.
Quite true.
So I am not convinced that the law
is the right mechanism to handle it. All right, let's broaden the discussion. Ranjana Kumari, many of the responses that are daily shocking us, because you're seeing them on television, you're reading about them in the papers, ignore the fact that gang rape is not primarily a sexual act. It's a deliberate attempt to dominate and subjugate through violence, born of a deep disrespect and disregard for women. Would you agree that it is a much deeper problem than seems to be addressed by these people who are speaking up?
Absolutely. It is, as I said in the beginning itself, it's a kind of power relations. It is the, trying to control, trying to subjugate, trying to teach a lesson. And that is why you see that rape has been used as a tool, not only in terms of, controlling the women within the family, by neighbors, by relatives, by, so many rapes happens within the family. People are not even talking about it. So in that sense, it is to exercise that control. And also it is used as weapon of war. I mean, like, look at the way people are being subjugated wherever there is army, military, police. Inside the police station, we have heard about rapes. So it is really a kind of, the mindset which travels across the board, as long as we will have the inequalities which is there in the society, as long, and society will take its own process of change. So certainly I agree with Dipankar that we need to, having law is not enough. Law has to be implemented.
Quite
it has
true.
to be enforced. And also people have to be punished
Absolutely.
for the crime that they are committing. If they make statements, the kind of statements they are making, they should be taken to the task, because they are not only violating the dignity of women, they are talking against the Constitution of India. So they should be put behind the bars for making such statements.
Absolutely. Let me stop you there and bring in Pavan Verma. Pavan Verma, you heard Ranjana Kumari describe rape as a weapon of war. Would you also accept that it is a direct product, not just of an attitude that is akin to war, but it's also a direct product of our bringing? It is a result of the fact that we bring up our sons and treat them as if they were little gods, whilst treating our daughters as if they were a curse. And the attitudes engendered in childhood simply work themselves through as we become adults.
No, there is no doubt that certain attitudes encourage this kind of patently criminal act. But the real reason, Karan, is also the fact that there is now today in our society a very fragile nexus between action and punishment. Unless that nexus is restored, people will continue to play with the law with impunity. You know, in the Bhavri Devi case, it's been more than a decade and the criminals have not been brought to justice, nor has the victim sensed that justice has been done. So you must have exemplary, effective, quick, predictable punishment for violation of law. But I believe that beyond that, and that's a very important step, in order to change mindsets that we were talking about, I believe that laws are important, but it takes time for mindsets to change. And for that, 2 or 3 things are very important. First is the progressive empowerment of women. Education, 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 so that they are aware of their rights. When a girl child goes to school and receives a different kind of exposure. The second is that this continued public expression of outrage is essential. This establishment does not budge unless it faces the pressure of public opinion. Another possibility is that politicians across the spectrum must come to a compact that they will ostracize or take action against politicians who make patently regressive statements. And lastly, and I say this with complete seriousness, the middle class, which often projects itself as the citizen of what is right and of morality, must do more self-introspection of how far they are willing to implement these ideas in their own lives.
What about something very specific, Dipankar Gupta? There is a view, perhaps patronized most of all by the left, that it is the so-called commodification of women, either by Western consumerism or even by our own Bollywood films, that is to blame for the way we view women and therefore respond to rape. To what extent does that fuel the problem?
There is no scientific evidence of that. There is no scientific evidence at all. It is not a good thing to do. I agree with that completely. It's not good to commodify women. It's not good that women themselves willingly commodify themselves. But there's no evidence to show that this leads to rape. You know, I must tell you that rape, the incidence of rape came down drastically by 75% in New York simply because the police implemented the law rigorously and without fail and without ignoring minor crimes. That's how rapes the incidence of rapes were lessened. Now, if we go on and on talking about attitudes and changing attitudes, we'll really be chasing our tails again and again. You have to break free. Now, in every society where they have broken free and done something progressive, leadership, political leadership, has played a very important role. Once these issues get a head up, and then if the cap fits, people fall in line. But unfortunately, for laws to be implemented in our country, you must have the political leadership in line. This is something which Pavan mentioned earlier. And I want to emphasize that with as much emphasis as I can, that without that political leadership acting in tandem with law enforcement authorities, you will never be able to make an impact. And when it comes to changing attitudes, remember, it takes some time for the law to have its impact so that attitudes later on become a habit. And that habit formation doesn't happen overnight.
Quite true.
But we must stay the course, and we have to fight it systematically, and we should not be led to all kinds of idealistic pronouncements, because that is basically something that gladdens the hearts of those who are liberal-minded people, but takes the issue no further.
Amu Joseph, we have a sort of consensus this evening that there has to be an emphasis on the law, although I know that you don't fully agree with that. And we also believe that changing mindsets is going to be difficult and slow. It will only happen in the long run. And yet the sad truth is that even during the mass protests at India Gate and Jantar Mantar, there were instances of molestation. How do you, as a woman and a feminist, explain that to yourself? How do you account for the fact that the very men who were out there protesting against rape were also molesting the women beside them?
Well, I suppose any gathering of large crowds brings all kinds of people there, so we can't assume that everybody there was really there to protest against the rape. Many antisocial elements may have been there, and they may well have been the ones who indulged in such activities. But what I wanted to say is that it's really not either or. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be changes in the law or that it should not be implemented more effectively, the whole criminal justice system overhauled, etc. I'm sure that should happen. But there is, I mean, you cannot, in many ways I feel that if we had paid more attention to the whole mindset issue 20 or 30 years ago when we first started talking about rape, maybe we would have come somewhere along the line. And instead, we seem to be having even worse and more regressive attitudes. And I think that may have something to do with the fact that many changes have been happening, dramatic changes have been happening in Indian society, in the economy, in politics, in culture.
Quite true.
And there has been no compass. There's no compass to help people navigate this highly altered terrain. And I think that is something that where we probably have failed to provide some kind of guideline on, explaining things. I mean, changes that are happening. And I also just want to respond to this whole thing about empowering women. I think for the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of effort has been put into empowering women. I think it is time to put a lot more time and energy into enlightening men. Because unless men's mindsets change, I don't think we're going to get very far.
We need to take a quick break, but when I come back, I want to therefore ask one simple critical question. If changing mindsets is going to prove difficult and take time, how then do we respond to these continuing views that we hear on television and read in the papers? Should we be publicly critical of them? Should we seek to shame them? Or should we simply ignore them? That's the question in a moment's time. See you after a brief break.
This is TV18, and you are watching CNN IBN.
Welcome back to The Last Word. How should we respond to conservative and often objectionable responses to rape? Pavan Verma, first of all, do we need to loudly and publicly criticize and perhaps even shame those who hold these views? Or is it more sensible to simply ignore them?
I don't think, Karan, we should ignore them. I believe that we need to counter them, we need to criticize them, and where we can to shame them. And this is done most effectively, I think, by women themselves. There are no such thing, I believe it's a utopian construct to talk of enlightened men as an entity unto themselves. Men will be enlightened when women tell them that they will not accept aberrant or otherwise behavior. Secondly, and most importantly, and I want to reiterate that point, unless there is quick, effective, predictable and exemplary deterrent action, you are not going to change society. While other things change slowly, it is ultimately this fear that will make men understand the limits of what is tolerable or enlightened behavior.
Dipankar Gupta, focus for a moment for me on Asaram Bapu. How important is it that his views, spoken as a spiritual leader, must be countered by equally prominent religious leaders disagreeing with him? Dipankar Gupta?
Well, I suppose they should. It is Yes, hello. I think they should counter it, not just religious leaders. I think, people across the board should counter it ideologically. They shouldn't let something like this pass. But remember, as I said to you earlier, if what Asaram Bapu says becomes practice, and people actually begin to practice those things and deny women the right to equality, at that point the law should come down heavily on the man.
Absolutely.
But till that time, you can take the soft approach and talk sociology and philosophy. But when he says that women cannot do this, or they must wear a certain kind of clothing, or we'll attack them, or schools must insist that girls wear overcoats, when these things happen, these are against the law, and the law should come down heavily on them and not do soft sociology.
I'm going to have to end this particular show on that point. My apologies to Ranja Kumari. I wasn't able to bring her in, and sadly we lost the line to Amu Joseph. But the bottom line that everyone's agreed on is that the law must be enforced. That's a message to our politicians, a message to our police, a message above all to our judiciary. Enforce the law and people will toe the line. If you don't, they'll take advantage of your negligence. Goodbye. Good night.